Morning, everybody. That's terrific. Thank you very, very much. We got 25 minutes together, but I promise you it's going to seem much, much longer. So we're going to talk about the future of higher education. And let me start here. So the United States is undergoing a transformation from a national analog industrial economy to a global digital information economy. And one of the challenges we're really facing right now is that all of our social institutions, not just colleges and universities, but all of our social institutions, government, healthcare, finance, media, were all created for the former. And the result is that they all seem to be out of date. None of them seem to be working anymore. And what's going to be required is every one of those organizations needs to be refitted for a new and emerging world. Now, it's easier, and we talk far more about what that world's going to look like than we do about how we're going to get there. And we know what it's going to look like. The characteristics of the refit are going to be dictated by the times. The fact is, the changes that will occur won't occur because we will them. They won't occur because we want them. They're going to occur because times demand them. And what I'd say is, the work that we're all doing will help shape those changes. It'll speed those changes. But if none of us did any of the work that we're talking about, this changes over the long run would still occur. Let me describe the kinds of changes that I think are going to occur. And everybody here seems to think as well. And the reality is, the big one, the most fundamental change that's going to occur is a shift in education from teaching to learning. And the reason that's going to occur is this, that we have an education system that was created for an industrial society. And it looks like an industrial society. It was modeled after one of the most successful technologies of the era, the assembly line. And it worked really well for a while. But what industrial societies do is they fix process. The process is the same for everybody. The time is the same for everybody. The only variable is outcomes. With information economies, it's the reverse. What information economies say is, all we care about is the outcome. We don't care how you got there. We don't care how much time it takes you to get there. So we're talking about a world in which outcomes are fixed and process is variable, and so is time variable. But once you agree, once you say, yeah, that's really what's going to happen, we're really going to move from teaching to learning, everything else that's going to happen is, to a very great extent, follows. It's just enhanced by the availability or enabled by the availability of digital technologies. So let's talk about what some of those things are likely to be. One is, we're moving from prescribed locations and prescribed calendars to anytime, any place learning. Digital technology makes that possible. We're moving from one size fits all to customized, and with that change, individualized or personalized, or whatever one chooses to call it. And that's a natural phenomenon of focusing on learning. People learn at different rates. Once you accept learning as the outcome and the measure we care about, personalization, aided by computers, aided by technology, is inevitable. The other thing that's going to happen is, we're going to move from credits and degrees to competencies and micro-credentials. And what's going to drive that is this. We created the credit system in the 19th century because higher education was undergoing this enormous change. And we needed some way to measure progress. And the way we did it was in time. And we created a common unit that measured time for all people. Once you switch to learning, everything changes. What happens is we need a measure of learning to see how you're progressing. And that's competencies. And what we need are, we're going to develop credentials that are tied to those competencies, and that's going to cause micro-credentials. So that too is going to happen. And what we're going to see is the end of institutional transcripts. They'll become lifelong transcripts. And what will also happen is, I think we're going to see a fundamental change in who's going to college. And that change will be this. We're living in a time in which 79% of all jobs that are being lost in this country are being lost to automation, and in which the half-life of knowledge is getting shorter and shorter and shorter. What that means is there's a constant need to be retrained, upskilled, and we're going to find a group of students who now come to college not because they want a degree, not because they want what we've traditionally offered, which is just-in-case education. We're giving you this education in case you need it. They're going to show up, and what they're going to demand is just-in-time education. By Thursday, teach me Swahili. And that's going to be an extraordinary market, which in numbers, given the ferocity of change in our culture, will be a tidal wave in comparison to what traditional students have been. It's really the market that's going to build. It's only a question of which institutions will welcome those students. Okay, so if that's what's going to happen, the real question is, how's it going to happen? And I want to take 3 cracks at that with you today. And what I want to say first is, given the fact that we have to refit the current model of higher education, how do you do that? You really got 2 choices. One is, you can try to repair the existing model, or you can try to replace it, create new institutions. And what happens is, replacement is the model in the for-profit community. What's also true is that for not-for-profits, change is primarily by repair. And so what we've seen is, we've seen things like other knowledge organizations like newspapers and music and books. The organizations that were doing it historically have been replaced. And what you see in higher education is, we don't have much happening in that way, at least not on a scale that's recognizable. The other thing that's true is, for adults, older adults, there's an age divide. As a generality, older adults who remember when the social institutions worked are more inclined to repair. And younger adults, for whom those institutions never worked, are inclined to replace. And that's a really important distinction. And I don't know anywhere in which it's more apparent than going to a meeting of higher education folks and then following it by coming here. So, I think if you really want a glimpse of what's going to happen in higher education, take a look at those other organizations that have been forced to change more quickly. What do we learn about what's going to be demanded of higher education if we look at newspapers and what happened to them? If we look at books and what happened to them? If we look at music and what happened to it? What we'll find is a set of pressures that higher education is going to feel as well. And they're worth knowing about, they're worth looking at, they're worth seeing the cases. Okay, second, where's change going to happen? And I guess it must have been the 1950s, David Reisman wrote about, sociologist at Harvard, described academia as a snake-like academic procession with the most elite institutions at the head of the beast and the least elite at the tail. And he said, all of higher education follows the head. It all follows the elite institutions. He got it exactly backwards Reform doesn't start at elite institutions. Change doesn't start at elite institutions. Change in higher education historically has come from two sources. One source has been new institutions and new organizations created at the periphery of higher education that do higher education. And the second one is from the tail of the beast, from those institutions that are in the most trouble. We're going to see a lot of that in the next few years. We have too many colleges in the Middle Atlantic, Northeast, and Midwest. They've got to do something if they want to stay open. And we'll see the most dramatic reforms happening in those places. What happens is that's where it begins. And the more successful the changes move up the hierarchy. And what ultimately happens is when it gets to the most elite institutions, change comes through their least elite units. So when we get to elite institutions, look for their continuing education unit. That's where you'll see the changes first. What do elite institutions do? They validate. Others experiment. Others try new models. And the elite institutions have the role of providing a good housekeeping seal of approval. This is the reform worth doing. My favorite is, I had a student who did a dissertation with me, and he looked at the adoption of freshman seminars, among other things, at Stanford and Berkeley. Each of the institutions claimed they got it from Harvard. The reality was, and it can be documented, they both got it from San Jose State. We claim, we robe our changes in elite institutions. We make our changes in other types of institutions. The elite institutions serve a very important role. And by the way, that's not true of all elite institutions. We certainly see institutions like ASU. We see institutions like MIT. We see institutions like Purdue. We see Stanford. And they're all in the business of experimenting. All of them are doing serious experiments. But what happens is those institutions are invaluable in changing higher education, because what they end up doing is they're the diffusers. They're the place people turn to get the new models. And they're the primary source for bringing innovation from the bottom and innovation from the periphery to the center. Third piece. So by what process is all this going to occur? We talked about the type of change that might occur. We talked about where it might occur. What's the process? I'm currently amidst writing a book about the future of higher education. And what it says is if you really want to understand the future, you got to look in three directions. Direction one is you got to look backward. This isn't the first time which higher education has been transformed. That happened when we went from an agrarian to an industrial society. You got to project forward all the changes that are occurring, demographic, economic, technological, global, and you have to look sideways at those institutions that changed more quickly. I'm going to take you back to looking backward for just a moment. It's enormously instructive. During that era, higher education really did change. And the scale of it was, we had colleges then when we started the industry with the end of the agrarian era. Just colleges, 4-year, largely religious colleges. And they became comprehensive universities. They became 2-year colleges. And some of them even turned into high schools, which didn't exist before the 19th century in the US. What also happens is, for the first time, courses were created. Credits were created. Carnegie units were created. What happened at the same time? Grad ed, research, disciplines, professional schools. All that was new. All those things that we take as staples today were products of the industrial era transformation. It occurred in 7 stages. The first stage was broad criticism of higher education. So the state government in Connecticut looked at Yale, which had a classical curriculum, and said, here you are, bless you. They didn't say bless you. They didn't say bless you, I did. What they said was, looking at Yale, your program, which is 1,000 years old, having begun in the medieval universities, is badly out of date. It's really irrelevant, and it costs too much. So higher education, this was happening all over the country. People were saying this about higher education. Universities responded in this fashion. They said, you're wrong. And most did nothing. They tried to hold on to the old programs. There was a period that followed of experimentation. All the things that I said changed. Different colleges tried them. Let's add a graduate program. Let's add some science and technology. Hey, what if we had modern language? Lots of experiments were tried, and most of them failed. After the Civil War, something that's very important occurred. The experiments were turned into real models at scale. 3 new institutions came into being. One was Johns Hopkins. And here's an institution that said, you know what? This is what graduate education looks like. This is real graduate education. We're a graduate school. We don't even have an undergraduate program. And Cornell University, which was a land grant, got created. And what Cornell said was, here's what a comprehensive university looks like. Here are all the pieces, here are all the parts. And MIT came along and said, here's what a tech school looks like. We had 3 distinct models to guide higher education. And what happened was a validator took them. It was Charles Eliot at Harvard University. He adopted every one of those things at Harvard. And because it was Harvard, because it was Eliot, it diffused to colleges all over the country. It was really the time was right. And all those innovations moved from the peripheral new institutions to the center of the enterprise. And Harvard was the primary agent for accomplishing that. What then happened was, you know, higher education, every institution's independent. So they all created their own programs. They couldn't agree on what a course looked like. How long is a course? How do you measure a course? How do you know what that is? They all have different definitions of credits, how you measure this, different assessments. And so we created something. We created accreditation. And their job was to be the sheriff in town. Standardize this stuff. Get it to be standard. We want the same practices at every institution in the country. A credit's got to mean a credit, a course has got to mean a course. And you all have to play by that definition. And then what followed was a final period in which all of those pieces, the 2-year college, the technical schools, the universities, the colleges, all of it was brought together. And that occurred in 1960. And it occurred in California with the California Master Plan, which created a comprehensive higher education system, including research universities, state colleges, and community colleges. And that's been the model that we've had that's guided us since the 1960s. But the world's changed, and we're heading to a new model. And what I would say about that is, we're at the very earliest stages here. And most of our presentations have been about experiments. We're all launching different kinds of experiments here. And I think the aspiration for every one of those experiments is that it'll be the model. And that'll take time. Models come at particular moments. It turns out the President Brown in 1842 nailed it. He knew exactly what the university was going to look like after the Civil War. Perfect. He got fired several years later because he'd nearly bankrupted Brown. People wanted that university in 1875. They didn't want that university in 1842. Timing really matters. Oh my goodness. Okay, so let's bring this thing to a close. Okay, we're trying to invent that institution at MIT, or with MIT, Woodrow Wilson. We're creating a graduate school of education. It's going to be it's competency-based. What we're doing is we're saying here are the skills and knowledge teachers need to have. It dispenses with courses and credits, and instead creates problem units that are mastery-based, that students pass through. And what I'd say is, an example of a problem, you just gave a test. All of your students failed. What are you going to do? We don't care about the cutesy answer. What we care about is, are you competent at assessment? Are you competent at lesson planning? Are you competent at understanding how kids learn? Are you competent in your subject area? So we've thrown out the clock. Mastery-based, individualized. One size can't fit all in that kind of program if you're moving through according to mastery. We're throwing out philosophy of ed and trying to replace it with learning sciences based upon how people actually learn. We're adding new methods of pedagogy, simulations, games, and we're redesigning clinical education. Much of our work really deals with diffusion. It doesn't pay today to create hothouse models. The key is to try to bring them to scale. And so what we're doing is we're positioning this as a resource center. Everything that we have is going to be open source. If you like it, come take it. Take all of it, take a part of it, do what you want with this. We're also working on policymakers. Woodrow Wilson's had a long history of working in the policy area at the state level with governors, legislators, chief state school officers, state higher education executive officers. And the idea is to encourage regulation, which would encourage institutions to adopt this kind of program. And finally, we're working on schools to build a demand for this and prepare teachers who are already in schools to be able to do this. So here's the thing we can't tell. We have degree granting authority, and we're enrolling our first class in September. They'll be working for master's degrees. And we can't tell you what's critically important, and we'll only know with time. Are we creating another experiment, or are we creating a model? Whichever it is, it's certainly worth trying, as are all the things that are being talked about here. Thank you all very, very much.